Good afternoon, everyone. As Rector Magnificus of Maastricht University, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to Maastricht today. This special event is organized by Studio Europa Maastricht, a center of expertise for Europe-related debate and research, part of our university, and a partnership with the province of Limburg and the city of Maastricht. Since 1992, the city has been inextricably linked to Europe as the Maastricht Treaty established the European Union. This treaty paved the way for a single currency, the euro, and created EU citizenship. The signing of this milestone for European integration started a great, dynamic experiment which carries on to this day. European unification was founded on the principles of community and solidarity. A common interpretation of this principle is sometimes lacking in Europe, but these principles can provide guidance on how to organize European cooperation in times of crisis, such as during pandemics, the climate crisis, and, as very evident today, geopolitical tensions. But what does this mean for the Netherlands? For an answer to this question, I have the honor to introduce to you today's speaker, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of the Netherlands, Sigrid Kaag. Today, Minister Kaag will share her vision on the recently appointed Dutch Cabinet's EU course and on how the Netherlands can play a leading role in strong and decisive European Union. Minister Kaag is the country's first female finance minister. She previously served as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister for Foreign Trade and Development Cooperation. Before joining politics as the leader of the Social Liberal Party D66, she held several senior positions within the United Nations. As the most European university in the Netherlands, we are proud to host this special event in Maastricht, where 30 years ago, the Treaty of Maastricht sealed Europeans' commitment to develop our collective identity. Minister.
Thank you very much, Rector Pamela Habibovic, and host, of course, Mathieu Zegers, for the warm welcome and the invitation. Dear students, Madam Mayor, Regional Councillors, die eigentliche Heimat, die mein Herz sicher wählt, Europa, ist mir verloren, seit es sich zum zweiten Mal selbstmörderisch zerfleischt im Brüderkriege. Even the true home of my heart's desire, Europe, is lost to me after twice tearing itself suicidally to pieces in fratricidal wars. The Austrian writer Stefan Zweig wrote these words at the end of his life. He's someone I've long admired, and he was, it won't surprise some of you, on the syllabus when I was young and I learned German in gymnasium, in high school, secondary school in the Netherlands. And he lived at a time of great progress, but also great discord and fatal destruction. He was born in 1881 and he took his own life in 1942. Speaking about the two world wars which he witnessed and lived through, he said, furchtbarsten Niederlage der Vernunft und des wildesten Triumphes der Brutalität innerhalb der Chronik der Zeiten. The most terrible defeat of reason and the most savage triumph of brutality ever chronicled. And he would not live to see that peace. And when I accepted the very kind invitation to speak to you today about European unity, we actually all thought, or maybe made ourselves believe, that war on this continent was very much a thing of the past. The world wars Stefan Zweig lived through seemed like a distant nightmare. The war in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s and fighting in the Donbass as recent as 2014 had terrible consequences for the people involved, citizens, innocent citizens. And for the Netherlands, in some way or another, both conflicts did come very close, but ultimately they seemed very far away. Until the dark night of the 23rd of February, when Vladimir Putin put an end to the peace we had all mistakenly, as it now seems, taken for granted, in attacking and brutally invading a democratic and sovereign Ukraine. A country that, in the words of its courageous President Zelensky, wants to build its own history, peacefully, calmly, and truthfully. 80 years after Zweig's death, almost to the day, war, in its abhorrent form, has returned to the European continent. And I echo the words that Prime Minister Mark Rutte recently spoke in our parliament. We condemn the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine. We condemn this unprecedented act of aggression against a democratic European country. We condemn President Putin and his clique, and our hearts are with the people of Ukraine. Putin's invasion has come to us as a rude awakening. And on the news shows, for instance, some of you may know it, if you are Dutch citizens, for young children, Jeugdjournaal, children were asking if this actually means that war would come to our doorstep too. The threat of armed conflict hangs over other parts of the world all too frequently. Many countries, many unresolved conflicts. But it's become rare in our corner of the planet. And we owe this to the very ever closer union between the peoples of Europe that arose from the fratricidal conflict Zweig wrote about. A partnership of peace which this city played a historic role in when the Maastricht Treaty was signed 30 years ago, the birth certificate of our shared European citizenship and, as Minister of Finance, I'd have to add, our single currency. As a result, in recent years, it's true for both politicians and ordinary citizens that the further war or conflict receded into the past, the more self-evident peace seemed. And not just peace, but everything that should go along with peace. Democracy, freedom of speech, tolerance, and inclusion, to my mind. But we've taken this state of affairs for granted and have actually forgotten it requires attention, nurturing, and maybe even love. And this heedlessness can itself pose a threat. And I mean this quite literally. In the Netherlands and beyond, in many European countries, we see how journalists, the judiciary, scientists, administrators, politicians, local, regional or national, are faced with threats and violence, aggression and intimidation. These people form actually in their roles, in the tasks they undertake, the foundation of our civilization. They supply our society with oxygen. And therefore it's unacceptable that they have to undertake their work in a climate of fear and insecurity. It's unbecoming and unbefitting Europe. It's a threat to the foundations of community and solidarity on which our union rests. While heedlessness is a clear and present danger to Europe and the values we hold dear, skepticism about the functioning of the European Union is not. I'm acutely aware, as I think many of you are, of the shortcomings of our unfinished project. Commitment to the euro we made here in Maastricht has brought us great benefits in this century, but it's also plunged us into problems, such as the euro crisis. Or when it comes to migrants or refugees, we've had times within the Union to agree actually on a united course of action, a course that's humane, just, and properly managed for every country. But let's seize on the current crisis in which hundreds of thousands and millions, as it now seems, of Ukrainians have had to leave their homes and have sought or are seeking shelter and protection elsewhere. Let's show more unity, let's maintain this unity, let's focus on our drive and purpose, more than we were perhaps able to do so in the past, in a consistent manner. Because when it comes to our shared values and the rule of law, we were not always able or willing to uphold our own principles. So it is time. And as we list our failures or our relative shortcomings, let's also count our blessings. First and foremost, the Union is unmatched as an engine of peace. It brings the people of Europe a level of security and stability they've never known in the decades before its inception. And today, as our very security and stability is under threat, The Union is more important than ever as its protector, as its guardian. Less tangible, but no less precious, is the value of our shared culture and the social cohesion that it generates. This is what unites us in diversity, why we feel at home on this continent. This feeling is upheld by voices and creative works from the past that continue to put their stamp on our present-day thinking and dreams. From Stefan Zweig to Simone de Beauvoir, from Béla Bartók to Salvador Dalí. The source is inexhaustible. I'm happy to be corrected by young people, the most recent artists, musicians, and all others that bring creativity into our world. They bring beauty. Contemporary thinkers and artists build on that foundation and sometimes help us set off on radical new paths. Consider our European cities, which are hotbeds of creativity, or the companies, be they startups or established businesses, or scale-ups, that contribute to the new economy in innovative ways. And in this, they actually benefit from being part of the world's largest single market, and from European Union citizenship, which gives us the freedom to travel unlimited and live anywhere we choose in the European Union, cutting through red tape, standardizing rules, and promoting international trade have all given our economies a tremendous boost. If I just look at the Netherlands GDP is structurally 3.1% higher due to the trade advantages of the European Union, and that is still a conservative estimate. It counts. This means we're one of the countries that actually stands to gain continuously from increased trade. It's a percentage, a number, but it says something about our lives. It means more money that's available for good quality healthcare, for high-level education, for our living environment, for the future. It means a small business owner from Maastricht can easily do business across the border in Hasselt or in Aachen. After the financial crisis of 2008, there was a growing realization that greater integration was also needed in our banking sector, with joint oversight and the same rules for everyone. And this enabled us to create financially strong banks where people could deposit their money with confidence that you would actually get it back. Even during the pandemic, which caused historic economic stagnation, the banks stayed afloat. This is something to be proud of. It sounds sometimes far away, but it's super important for ordinary citizens. It's something to cherish and to build on in times of stability, but also in times of crisis. The Union is a story of small failures and great successes, of joint efforts that don't always achieve what we would like them to do. But for now, we find ourselves at a historic crossroads, a turning point. It's been said by many, and I'd like to reiterate it. The war in Ukraine, the crisis, has been a brutal wake-up call. In the past few weeks, we've seen in Europe unprecedented shows of unity and decisiveness. Will the Union simply continue to muddle along or muddle through, making compromises, as the writer Caroline de Gruyter described in her latest book, or have we finally turned a page? The unprecedented crisis that we now experience demands another type of union, a union which doesn't just muddle through, but looks ahead. It looks into the future. And let's seize on this crisis in which our dependency on Russian gas and oil should not be a brake on our values. So we become energy independent as quickly as we possibly can. Let's seize on this crisis to invest in our own armed forces and intensify, at the same time, defense cooperation between and amongst member states. If our peace, security, and shared values are at stake, we need to have the capacity to deliver and to stand as one. And I hope sincerely that we can follow through on this, also in better times, so we can prevent, deter, and ultimately prevail. Because times like these demonstrate once more the notion of the European Union as a partnership that isn't a question, but a fact. It's the institution in which we in the Netherlands have to commit to fully, because it's also in our national interest. In my opinion, the idea spread by Eurosceptic politicians that the Union undermines our sovereignty is a misconception. or even cynical posturing. The Union doesn't undermine our sovereignty. On the contrary, it strengthens it. It gives us wings. So where would this bring us today? Where does our European Union stand at the start of 2022? What kind of a world do we live in? It's no understatement or euphemism to underline that these are very, very tense and scary times. On the eve of Brexit, it seems actually quite a while ago, Mathieu, I don't know if you have the same feeling, he wrote that Europe's vacation from history and politics was over, and that was then. The biggest shock to the European Union then seemed Brexit. Life has not become calmer, on the contrary. The most recent and frightening example, of course, of my statement is the war on our continent, which threatens the security of our citizens. First and foremost in Ukraine, but also beyond. And I am pleased, I am proud, and also relieved to see that the European Union is responding with unprecedented unity, unity of purpose, unity of voice. But also we've lived through, we would almost forget it, through the COVID-19 pandemic. And we could be forgiven for seeming to forget this, but we've only recently come out of it. And we hope we're finally over its peak, but if it has taught us anything, these 2 years of pandemic, these last 2 years, it's taught us that there is no certainty. There is no certainty because we also have the climate crisis, which is an undeniable and inescapable fact, unless we choose to act. All these challenges raise the question even more emphatically, the question, what binds us? What binds us together as member states, as European citizens? What are the issues we need to tackle together? What are the issues we actually want to avoid or actually choose to not collaborate on? First and foremost, what are our values? And how far are we prepared to go in defense, in protection of these very values? Because when the chips are down and the pressure is up, we need to manage to recognize the value, the intrinsic value of this partnership. In an increasingly unstable world, EU member states are not only our neighbors and friends, they are our intrinsic partners, and we need to cherish that. So a weighty responsibility lies on the shoulders of this generation of politicians. My generation, but actually I'd like to say your generation, because you are the future. To keep the EU stable and safe, more so than at any other crossroad. The present moment calls for a forceful, credible, pro-Europe, a pro-European stance. And do not confuse or misunderstand me. Being pro-European doesn't mean an attitude of uncritical acceptance of whatever European is perfect. No. We do not do the European project just because by giving it any favors. We don't do it, we don't give it any credibility if we act as if it's perfect, or if it's perfect or has no flaws. But one thing is clear, the present government, and the President referred to it, wants to play a leading role in shaping and furthering a strong and effective and credible European Union. A role that the Netherlands feels actually home in. Especially now, because there's so much at stake. But dear students and dear guests, Lysander Gibb, a German student, he's actually at a course in European Public Affairs in Maastricht. He's online, not in the auditorium. He asked me via a video message prior to this speech what the Netherlands' priorities actually are for the EU, particularly in the sphere of finance. But as I see it, there are three. First of all, our geopolitical role, which is connected to our role in the economy and in finance. But in particular respect to the European Union as a community of values, a champion of values and the rule of law. Secondly, of course, financial cooperation, the internal market. And third, last but not least, anything relevant to climate change as the key transnational task of the present. In normal times, my priority as finance minister would be financial stability. And it remains, of course, my primordial concern. But these are not normal times. Europe's main concerns and tasks and challenges lie in the geopolitical arena, because the impact of our choices will affect our economic stability and prosperity regardless. The images of Kiev, Mariupol and Kharkiv show a reality that is unfolding just 1,800 kilometers away. The war in Ukraine is testing Europe, and it leaves no room for hesitation. We cannot and will not allow Putin's illegal act of aggression to go unanswered. But first of all, when we talk cooperation, we need to remain united. This means effective political, military, and financial action. And for the first time ever, we've seen a European Union that has supplied another state, a non-European Union state, with defensive materials, with military equipment. This is an unprecedented development, which until recently we would not have considered possible. And the decisiveness which has been shown in these very few weeks needs to be maintained. As a union, we have to be more capable of resolving conflicts on our very own. It will mean that defense expenditure in the various member states will be a hot topic for debate, but I've seen that there is unity around the necessary choices that need to be made. The Netherlands wants to do its part for a stronger European defense partnership, a stronger Europe within NATO. And secondly, we need to use our strength, which lies in the European Union's size as a major economy. And I've often seen this from further afield when I was still Under-Secretary General in the United Nations. The call was always for the EU to act, and it often didn't manage to. But this time we have. Economic sanctions entail costs, but we should not be afraid of the impact on us, as daunting and as scary as it may be. Anything we feel will be felt harder by Putin and his clique. Instruments rooted in our prosperity and economic strength need to be deployed. And we need to strike and continue to strike at Putin's war chest in freezing Russia's foreign currency reserves and blocking, or the de-swifting, I believe a new verb, of the access of major banks to the payment network. And I reiterate my call on the European Commission to provide EU-wide regulation against corporate service providers for Russian investors. EU-wide regulation, this time again, has shown is the most effective to prevent companies from helping wealthy Russians hide their money through complex structures. It's at EU level we can strike and act. Nationally, we can do too, but it's much less effective. So let the unity we display here be an example for the future. We are a major economic power, but we need to dare to exemplify this through the political will at the same time. We can't hide or lean against the United States. We cannot be dependent on China for crucial medical supplies. And we cannot ourselves to be a plaything in the hands of Russia, which has turned its back on the international legal order, the existing European security architecture, and ultimately on the universality of human rights, international law, and the rule of law. We therefore continue to push the abolition of the veto in the case of sanctions, human rights violations, and civilian missions. And finally, if we wish to remain an economic power, which is ultimately necessary as a duty towards our citizens, but also to enhance our ability to exert influence in other areas, we do not want to be overly dependent on other countries. We need to embrace global competition with open arms. Without renouncing our values, we can maintain our unique and autonomous position in the world through smart industrial policy and our very own digital and technological innovations. In order to display unity to the outside world, we need to be united internally, and this requires work. We can talk about and compromise on the Stability and Growth Pact, or question what constitutes a sustainable investment, but that's never the case for our shared values. These are non-negotiable. This is our most important common denominator, the foundations on which our union was built. If we undermine those very foundations, we undermine our very presence, our community. This is why we collectively agreed on this point and enshrining it in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And if countries fail to adhere or to respect it, They need to be called into account, if necessary with use of the appropriate financial instruments. If the judiciary is not dependent, if legislation infringes on the equality of citizens, or if there is widespread corruption, we need to act to preserve the unity and the quality of the unity of our community, of the European Union. And last month, the European Court of Justice handed down a clear judgment in this matter. We would almost forget. With this judgment, the court recognized that shared values lie at the very foundation of the European Union, and that there can be no mutual trust without this very foundation. In my view, a Europe without this foundation is not a Europe we want. The Union can only be effective and can only work if everyone takes part. This brings me to my second priority, our financial stability. It may make us often uncomfortable to talk about money, prosperity, and well-being in the midst of the current political and military crisis, and above all, a crisis of humanity in our very midst on our continent, where people being displaced seek shelter and are suffering war trauma with tremendous insecurity if and when they're able to return home. But we do need to talk about our financial stability, because these are also important issues people worry about. How will the war affect me? How will it affect us? And what's more, if the European Union wants to assert itself in the world, a strong economic and financial basis is a prerequisite. The political response to destabilization is to continue enhancing our existing strength. A Dutch member of parliament drew a few weeks ago my attention to an insightful observation made by Aristotle, centuries and many centuries before the Common Era. In principle, he said, money is a means to pursue the good life, but in practice, it soon becomes an end in itself. We need to ensure this does not happen. Money is surely a means to enjoy a good life, if you can, and to preserve a bright future for Europeans of today and tomorrow, to make Europe a safe and clean continent which takes care of its people, and to protect citizens from war and aggression, a basic responsibility of any government, but also for people to enjoy equal rights and opportunities. And the euro and the single market have unquestionably brought us a great deal. To me, I think I'm restating it, but the European Union is about shared values which are more important than the market. But having the world's biggest single market helps us to ensure we can live in prosperity and comfort, welfare and well-being. This is particularly important to the Netherlands with an open economy based on fair and increasingly sustainable trade. But there are still people who question the use of the euro. They actually undermine and underestimate how much the euro actually benefits us. The euro makes it cheaper, easier and safer to trade within the eurozone, and above all with the rest of the world. Withdrawing from the euro would actually mean we give up a lot in terms of well-being, our prosperity now, and definitely in the future. And what's more, in international terms, the euro is a much stronger and more influential currency than the guilder would ever be. But unrest in the world is also affecting our economy, and that may be the understatement today if we look at gas prices, oil prices, and macroeconomic outlooks. But after a long period of low inflation and low interest rates, these indicators are still on the rise. It affects people's purchasing power. It makes people anxious and concerned. And countries are seeing their national debts increase, not knowing if and how the conflict in Ukraine will end. The war itself only makes matters worse, and we have to be honest about this. We live in very uncertain times. Higher energy prices are hitting people in their pockets. They also eat away in corporate profits. The impact of sanctions and possibly further retaliatory measures will be felt by our own citizens, as well as businesses across the continent. So uncertainty is currently a given, as we do not know how the conflict will end, and alongside how it will affect our economies. So we do not know yet how we will deal with the possible economic fallout. But there's no doubt that our security is worth it. And I see it as my job as Minister of Finance, with my colleagues in the Dutch cabinet, to try to cushion the negative effects and really try to assist those most affected and most vulnerable. It is no easy task, and I see this across Europe when I speak to my colleagues. We're all struggling with the same dilemmas. And the challenges come on top of the existing task of strengthening our economies after they were weakened. They suffered a dent in the pandemic, some countries more than others. The COVID-19 Recovery Fund, Next Generation EU, are building blocks underlying these efforts. So joint recovery remains important in finding a way forward. Joint recovery helps boost member states' resilience and adaptability. And in this way, we can reduce the social and economic impact of the pandemic, but as it increasingly seems, also of the current crisis, the war in Ukraine. Because we need to support green and digital transitions, not only through investments, but through structural reforms. It's in everyone's interest, crisis or not, for public finances in the Euro countries to be in a healthy state. I repeat, in times of instability, we need those foundations more than ever before as our building blocks. So it remains important to agree on the rules collectively, the rules of the game, so to speak, in order to create equality between countries and to provide a framework to manage our interdependence. And this is why we actually arrived at consensus in the Stability and Growth Pact on national debt levels and budget deficits. In the coming month, I'll be talking with my European counterparts on the matter of modernization of the Stability and Growth Pact. And I'm very well aware we have other, more pressing, more acute concerns at this time. But we do need to adopt a perspective which allows us to look ahead, to create a perspective for the decade ahead. We are duty-bound as politicians, duty-bound towards our citizens to provide perspective in the knowledge that uncertainty will continue to grow. If we all agree, we need to do things differently in order to move forward together, stronger than before. And the major transnational challenges of this time, climate change, security, and digitalization, demand determination and vision. They also demand political will. And I have an open mind and a constructive attitude towards this discussion with perhaps 3 guiding principles or so-called anchors. When it comes to the fiscal rules, heavily indebted countries need to focus on a reduction of their debt levels because it does make them more resilient in times of crisis. Many member states exceed the debt limit of 60% of GDP, so the pace actually of debt reduction will remain important, if not crucial. But we need to recognize that for some member states, a rapid reduction in national debt is just not very realistic, even before the Ukraine war. If we do not act, it undermines the credibility and public support for our agreed agenda, for the Stability and Growth Pact. But we cannot act as if nothing else has happened. We also know that many countries are struggling. So I actually propose that we modify some criteria. Member states with high levels of debt need to cut back to a prudent level at a responsible pace. And this cannot be done through budgetary means alone. These efforts need to be supported and encouraged by reform and investments alongside. And we can also assist member states in reducing the number of rules for member states with a low level of debt in order to increase public support. So we create also public and political convergence. A second anchor for the Netherlands is the importance of growing stronger together. That requires more rapid growth in the relatively poorer member states, reducing the difference with the most prosperous member states. This is the only way actual cohesion can be fostered and maintained in Europe. Because member states do need buffers, so a future economic crisis doesn't erode public investment. And in addition, and by no small feat, substantial public investment is needed in all member states to sustain growth, jobs, and create the market for the future. And the war in Ukraine has forced us to face some difficult facts. In the last few years, European fiscal rules have proven their flexibility in exceptional circumstances and sometimes hotly debated. But we arrived at a compromise, for instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic. And given the terrible course of events that we now witness, it's possible that, again, we need to be flexible in the application of the rules we agreed together. But it doesn't mean we should throw caution to the wind when it comes to public investments. It wouldn't be wise, and actually it doesn't help us to get ready for the future. We would weaken our most important geopolitical asset in the mid to long term. Member states, above all, need to all make smarter choices in their budgets, therefore creating scope for green and pro-growth investments. Member states can increase the quality and effectiveness of public expenditures. And thirdly and finally, the European Commission and the Council have not always been able to apply the Stability and Growth Pact in a manner that is consistent, transparent, and predictable, and that causes unease amongst member states. And I believe that's not necessary. We can avoid it. We can create a platform in which this can be done differently. This is why modernization needs to be accompanied by a better protection and alignment with the rules, better compliance. This involves review procedures and transparency, giving member states more control over and responsibility for their very own choices and policies. One option, in my view, is to allow countries to draw up their own debt plans to reduce debts, make investments and implement reforms. Accountability is a big responsibility. But these plans then need to be reviewed in a transparent manner, possibly through the inclusion of more automatic steps in the Stability and Growth Pact itself, if the norms are exceeded. The review can also be decoupled from the political process within the Commission and the Council and carried out by an independent body. This creates greater belief and trust, perhaps in the decisions and the outcomes, particularly when there is deviation. This would contribute to equal treatment of member states, but ultimately, in the discussions, these are political choices by member states if we arrive at an agreement. And in that way, the Stability and Growth Pact, not always talked about, but sometimes only when it is debated, can again function the way it was intended, to contribute to a healthy European economy. Member states that continue to grow stronger through structural reforms, that invest adequately in sustainability, digitalization, security, and work on healthy public finances. These member states form the integral part, the basis of an EU that can actually face up to the challenges of today and the future. In this way, we're not only looking at what lies in front of us, but really a decade ahead. This is important for all citizens in the Union, and of course, it's important to citizens in the Netherlands. And this brings me to my last and final priority. As I mentioned earlier, money should be considered a means to an end and not an end in itself. And at the time we live in, it will require large-scale investments to fight climate change, to keep our planet livable, for ourselves, for our children and grandchildren, for you here in the auditorium, for species, to preserve biodiversity, and for all Europeans of tomorrow. People and planet go hand in hand. And we are now not only investing, we shouldn't only invest for the sake of our planet. We need to make those choices. We need to reduce the dependency on fossil fuels because it affects the interests of Europeans in many ways. Putin has demonstrated his willingness and ability to use gas deliveries as a geopolitical instrument. And I also hear people when they speak of the unease in the continued dependency and purchase of Russian oil and gas, they have a sense they are feeding the war coffers. But we rely on Russia within the EU for no less than 40% of our gas imports. We need to reduce these imports as soon as possible. Besides helping to bring about a cleaner world, investing in renewable energy also contributes to a world where energy is a source of progress rather than tension. And there will be costs, but the benefits will be far greater. And I think here in Limburg, you understand that better than the people perhaps living in the Randstad conurbation. Last summer's terrible floods in the region demonstrated that the climate change crisis is a problem that takes no notice as we already knew, of national boundaries. But I believe many of us perhaps thought the climate crisis affects many countries very far away. So it's come home and it's been hard-hitting to see also its effects here in Limburg and neighboring countries. In neighboring countries, over 200 people died in natural disasters of a sort we've become unaccustomed to in recent decades, or at least in our part of the world. But sadly, as I just mentioned, in other parts of the world, the destructive power of nature is already very much a regular part of people's lives. It causes poverty, destruction. It also forces migration. In the early 1990s, our predecessors concluded the Maastricht Treaty, laying a key foundation of our lives today. Roughly between then and now, scientists tell us that around in that time, 28 billion tons of ice have melted. To put this in perspective, it's approximately 28 times the size of Mount Everest. I wish I could speak to some Dutch mountains. I know we have them here, but we're a bit short there on examples. But a silent disaster has been taking place around us, and we've been ignoring it for too long. The climate crisis is an existential crisis. And reading the latest report released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change makes for yet again a sobering experience. Climate change is irrevocably harming the natural world. Species are going extinct, and corals will die off and not return. Food security is on the decline. The number of deaths due to high temperatures is on the rise, and people are being forced to flee their homes. And I just mentioned it. So it's time, and time is of the essence, to take serious action at scale, because the source of all of this is us. We need to change our behavior. And by we, I certainly don't mean individual members in society. I mean governments, private sector, public sector. We need to invest. We need to take the right course of action. We need to determine the right policy options. And we're not short of knowledge. The facts are there and the instruments are available. So I'm glad, and I believe many of you are also relieved probably, that the European Commission has early on recognized this and demonstrated continuously a high level of ambition. A 55% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030 compared with 1990. In the period ahead, 30% of the European budget will be devoted to climate-relevant expenses, around 550 billion euros. And we're putting a price on CO2 emissions within Europe and on products imported from countries outside of Europe that have lower climate standards. And the Netherlands fully supports the ambition shown by the Commission. And to underscore this, we would like to be and remain a leader of the pack in Europe. We're going beyond the ambitions of the Commission by aiming for a 60% real-time reduction by 2030, an 80% reduction by 2040, and full climate neutrality by 2050. And as Minister of Finance, I'd like to underscore that the financial sector has a key role to play in all of this. Financial flows drive the economy. Choosing to finance sustainable initiatives over pollution or polluting initiatives will have a major impact. In my view, the financial sector's current commitment is only the starting point for necessary progress towards sustainability. And I would therefore call on the sector to continue to take the steps necessary and act as a role model for many others. Finance is central to all of our efforts. A decisive factor in making a successful transition to sustainability is an agreement on actually what counts and what doesn't count as a green investment. It's done, as you know, through the sustainable taxonomy, aiming to prevent so-called greenwashing of investments. But if we want to meet the Paris climate goals, and obviously it's not a matter whether we want to, we need to, natural gas cannot be part of the equation, in the Netherlands' view. And the war in Ukraine, and I believe the announcement by the European Commission today to accelerate a reduction and an end to our dependency on Russian gas will be, in this case, I cannot call it a blessing in disguise, but an important decision that has both geopolitical merit as well as climate benefits. So, dear students, let me be clear. The Netherlands' future is and always will be European. Stefan Zweig is a voice from our past. Zwischen unserem Heute, unserem Gestern und Vorgestern sind alle Brücken abgebrochen, he wrote. All the bridges are broken between today, yesterday, and the day before. Bridges demolished by the period in which he lived. His European voice still resonates 80 years after his death, and cruelly so at a time in which war seems closer than ever. A time which is not far from here. Bridges are literally being demolished, bombed, houses destroyed, lives ruined. The Dutch writer Lisa Weda has Ukrainian roots. She wrote a wonderful book about her grandmother, Alexandra, about her family in Donbass that tried, against all odds, to build a life for themselves on their native soil. Against all odds, because those in power were fighting over, and I quote, their land in which their dead were buried and where their children grew up. Now Lisa lies awake at night, fearful for her family. For us, this war is closer than ever. For Lisa Weda, her relatives, her Ukrainian compatriots of her family, it has entered their lives. It's not only borders and democracy that are at stake, but people like her family who simply, and I quote, want to stay in their own homes and live their own lives. These are the aspirations, commonplace aspirations, that bind us as human beings, not only in Europe, everywhere in this world. And it's our desire and duty as political leaders to contribute to these aspirations. We have a great, if not daunting, task on our shoulders. It will not be easy, but it's perhaps more important than ever. I go back to Mathieu Zegers. Europe's vacation from history is over, and it's been over for some time. Perhaps we didn't realize it. The war in Ukraine has shown us we need to act quicker, effectively, and decisively, as we've done and continue to do so we can look forward together towards a community of values, a society of values, and a society and a union in which all can prosper. This government stands for a European future with an outstretched hand to our brothers and sisters in and outside the Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very rich speech, dear Minister. My name is Mathieu Zegers. I will start the conversation today, building upon the speech you just gave. But first of all, I want to thank you for being here and welcome you. It's an honor and also a pleasure to welcome you here in Maastricht, 30 years after the signing of the Maastricht Treaty. But as you underlined in your own speech very clearly, we are meeting against a backdrop of a pitch black current state of affairs in Europe, war in Europe. And I think we should open the conversation with this current state of affairs. It was 5 years ago that Federica Mogherini, then the High Representative of Foreign Affairs within the European Union, was here to give a speech on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Treaty of Maastricht. And she then said to me, the Treaty of Maastricht was a true revolution in European politics. Because, and I quote her, it was the first time in the history of the world that an entire continent made building peace the common aspiration for the future. This promise, or this revolution, in the words of Mogherini, is now tested in a very serious way. We have war in Europe, and the first question that comes up then, and I think was also very much felt in the audience and in society, in European states, member states of the European Union and beyond, is, are we doing enough now? Is this enough? We have this package of sanctions. Are we doing enough to really live up to that promise of building peace and that aspiration of an entire continent, as it was indeed enshrined in the Treaty of Maastricht? Could you reflect on that?
Yeah, it's a very tough question. When it comes to the aspiration of peace, it is something, even in peaceful times, you need to work towards. Peace within society, peace through inclusion, combating discrimination, racism. I mean, peaceful societies are not just societies marked by the absence of war. That would be my first level. So we have a big agenda and a task ahead of us. Now, the war in Ukraine has actually has presented us with, I think, existential challenges to peace and security and stability in the Union, but it's also a moral question. And that's, I think, the heart of your question. Are we doing enough for fellow Europeans? Yes. And I think we are going as far as we can without indirectly or through the risk of error engaging or broadening the area of conflict. And that's, of course, a deep concern by all. We are united and firm politically within the EU, with the Americans, with Canada, EU and NATO. We've provided, of course, significant humanitarian support. Much more will be needed. We provide military equipment, an unknown before. But it will be in relation to the legitimate demands for self-defense by Ukraine. We are shielding through NATO, of course, the borders of the alliance. But it's been very clear, and I think all NATO, all leaders, also our Prime Minister has said, we will not be part of the war. And I think that's the moral question that I feel with citizens. They're worried about a spillover. At the same time, they are concerned if this is enough and how long the suffering of the people of Ukraine and the commensurate risks that may occur and continue to remain, how we can tackle that. Sanctions is a very big argument, a very big stick. And I think we shouldn't underestimate it. The fact that we've frozen the central bank assets of Putin and his clique is a big blow. However, by all estimates, he can still last a bit longer. And I think that causes not only unease, it's too polite a word. It makes us, it makes you feel unwell almost, to think that this is the instrument you use, and yet there is no end yet to the conflict. But we also need to focus on any option to de-escalate. So it's very uncomfortable, but there's no easy answer.
Maybe a follow-up question. What we see, for instance, President Zelensky asking from the West is not only sanctions, but more. More movement on the political front, on the geopolitical front. But also, for instance, asking for membership of the European Union. The European Commission, in the person of President Ursula von der Leyen, was relatively forthcoming in reaction to that first question, which was also a question in a broader context to the multilateralism of the post-war era, to which Zelensky directly asked, help me with the multilateralism that brought stability in your part of the world. I need that too. And the most obvious thing I can think of is membership of the European Union. Then there was this reaction of Ursula von der Leyen, and then, of course, now it's on the table somehow. What is the take of the Dutch finance minister on this very tricky political issue?
Well, there's no sort of minister of A or minister of B. There's a cabinet position, and that's been reflected by the Prime Minister. And I think his answer is a fair one. It says, let's tackle the current crisis. Let's always explore ways in which we can further and foster cooperation and the partnership with Ukraine, as well as with other countries that are deeply affected also as a corollary by the crisis. But this is now not the answer to end the war. So there's more needed to be an aspiring member. But of course the ask is clearly on the table. I believe a process will then be started. But I think our collective priority is to end the war, to restore sovereignty of Ukraine, to look at the needs of the country, to stabilize it macroeconomically. We, for instance, fast-forwarded guarantees to the economy through the World Bank to make sure that there's not a total economic collapse either, alongside, of course, the need to end the suffering of the people of Ukraine. All these matters need to be discussed in due course. If this were to be the total answer, maybe there would be a different response. But I don't think it will impress President Putin right now.
No. You are a very experienced diplomat. You have a long track record in international affairs, especially in the diplomatic realm. This is a very, very challenging crisis for European diplomacy. One of the main players at this moment who still seems to be in contact somehow with President Putin is Emmanuel Macron, the President of France. You are traveling to Paris tomorrow,
That's
if
right.
I understood correctly.
With the government delegation.
With the government of the Netherlands, with the Prime Minister and some the most involved...
Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Defense.
Yeah, the most involved ministers, so the Minister of Foreign Affairs also there, but you will be also part of that delegation of the Dutch government. President Macron is signaling already for years that there is more need for strategic autonomy of the European Union, and that not only means investing in more autonomy economically, but also a military capacity build-up. That is now, of course, very topical. He has some proposals on the table. For instance, a new fund next to the Next Generation EU Pandemic Fund. There should now be something like Repower EU, I think, is the buzzword that is put on that plan.
That's the energy fund,
That's the energy fund. But there should also be a defense fund or something.
Yeah.
That is at least what he is suggesting. Would that be something to invest in now collectively, or are we doing enough already on the defense front with different key member states like the Germans, for instance, heightening their budget with 100 billion euros? Or should we go with yet another fund to finance the defense?
I'm not quite sure if
ambitions?
finance ministers, if they have slight allergic reactions when there's too many funds. I'm not sure. We also established 2 funds in the Netherlands, climate funds and the combat the nitrogen crisis. I think there are three matters. How do you establish the Stability and Growth Pact, so make your rules of the game for the future? The discussion on so-called the green golden rule. Should you exclude green investments from your deficit procedures? And of course, now a country such as Poland has already in recent years said, well, we need defense spending to be recognized, and it should be sort of off budget. I'm a little bit hesitant on this approach. I think we need to decide what is the what. We need to agree on our ambition. We need to, for defense, we need to look at the capability that's required to be fit for purpose, now but also the future. We need to strengthen the European pillar within NATO. And then, of course, we need to assess with each other what are the means, financial means we need. Later on then, you could discuss.
So we have enough instruments already.
There are
available.
so many instruments. The choice is first what's required. It's easy to talk about money, but we're not in a situation where money is looking for ideas. We need to determine the form, and then function will follow. And then we need to always politically discuss about the financing and how we finance it and how we relate this to the sustainability of our debts. It's clear everybody is in agreement on the need to up our defense spending. And we're also in agreement that we need greater European cooperation within NATO, because we cannot always rely on leadership by the Americans. That's neither fair nor appropriate if we want to be a real player on the world stage. But we can do that together with the Americans in NATO. And then the next steps are, how would you finance this? We're also having this national debate. Now, all these other avenues, it's true, we're living in very tricky times. At the same time, it's paradoxical. In the greatest of crises, you still need to remain very level-headed, very strategic, and not take hasty decisions on every matter which has far-flung consequences. And that's my job, to sort of also state the unpopular, but you need to take stock and look ahead, because everything we decide now, we will feel this many years beyond this crisis. But this crisis has woken us up. It's shown us that we need to accelerate, we need to cooperate better, we need to determine the level of investments, but we also still need to do it in a sound manner, because we can only spend it once. And every country, we north, south, east, west, we all struggle with the same issues. But we are best when we do this together.
Very clear. Thank you. I would have loved to ask you more questions, for instance, about your plans for the revision of the Stability and Growth Pact, as also already signaled in the FT article of yesterday. But we only have like 15 minutes left, and I want to open the floor for the audience to ask questions. And I'm looking around to the first question. I think it comes from the left. And we will wait until the microphone is there and then hear what the question is.
Yeah, hi everyone. In light of the recent geopolitical developments in Europe, the Netherlands, among many European partners, is reviewing its military expenditures. More expenditures on one domain sometimes can diminish the attention towards other domains, for instance. So my question is, how should we balance the need for increased security without undermining the financial progressivity characterizing the Netherlands in the latest decade in the social domain? Thank you.
That's it's an important question. It's a highly political question too, as you may have guessed. But I think the importance is, as I just mentioned, we've all realized, sadly, that we need to do more to up our capability in defense, and we need to finance that. But that requires some thinking. At the same time, if you look at the climate crisis, it's not as if in our ability to resolve future military crises or invest in our deterrence, the climate crisis gets resolved. So it's not an either or. And I think all governments, and ours, is ready to discuss and view how the balance can be maintained. Same is when it comes to the social domain. Of course, we need to keep investing in our level of education to equip young people with the skills and the knowledge to be effective employees or leaders in the market of tomorrow. You cannot withhold that. That we've seen with a lot of dictatorship countries where defense spending is the biggest spending target, and their economy and their human capital, their own people, are left way behind. So I think we have the wisdom and the luxury that we have the means to try to find the right choices and build pathways, which is why the previous question of Mathieu is also very important. And there will be many discussions at the European level. The macroeconomic stabilization that will need to take place in face of this economic crisis that will hit us, or the economic consequences, not crisis, as the fallout from the Ukraine crisis, but particularly high energy and gas prices. A lot of the solutions and discussions will take place at the EU level.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question. I see here front.
Good afternoon, Mevrouw Kaag. About those high energy and gas prices, actually, I think one of the priorities of the EU is also fighting inequality. The cohesion funds are a really big chunk of the EU budget. And I think already in the Netherlands, 500,000 families are struggling to afford their gas bill. In Romania, it's 1 million families, so it's really a pan-European problem. So I was wondering, more specifically, how can we compensate these families, and how do you reflect on the statement of our Prime Minister that these families just need to have some more patience?
Well, if you refer to the statement by our Prime Minister this morning, I think he meant to reassure citizens, as I will too, that of course we're working on it. We're all deeply concerned, and we're fully aware that many people cannot make ends meet. They were already struggling before, and now due to the acute price hike and inflationary pressures alongside, they have price hike in the energy bills in particular, that they are really not getting by at the end of the month. And that's a source of concern. We do not want to trigger indebtedness of people. So we're looking at it with a great sense of urgency. But the response, and to be predictable and reliable in our response and solution, it needs a little bit more time. And that's, I think, what he tried to say. And I'm saying that too, and we're both passing the same message. But we need to look at it nationally, as well as discussions that we will be having also tomorrow, for instance, with the French Minister for Finance, on what would be European frameworks and agreements where we can look at financing to potentially help compensate. At the same time, I think the honest message is too, this crisis, we don't know yet the aftermath, when it will end, the conditions of its closure, and then the macroeconomic after effects. We cannot pretend as if everyone's prosperity will stay the same. We will suffer a collective loss in welfare. but we need to mitigate as much as possible the impact.
Thank you. Any other questions? I see here in front.
Well, what would or should Europe do if Finland is getting the same treatment as Ukraine? Finland is not a member of the NATO, and of course it's a different situation, but well, then next question is, and what about Moldavia? But Finland first, please.
But I'm going to apply something that I learned from the Prime Minister, because it's an appropriate answer, an als-dan vraag. I think it's a highly dangerous question, and I'm not going to even try to answer it. Of course, it's the serious risks that the Ukraine war entails has also, of course, immediately triggered NATO preparedness positioning around all borders of the alliance. And it's true, Finland is not a member, but let's not engage or let's not make any statements that would not be fully representative of government position. But I know the Prime Minister, Minister Hoekstra and Minister Ollongren are in continuous discussion on all matters of security in Europe.
But it is, of course, a very relevant point, as we see in Scandinavia, countries like, for instance, Denmark now, who is a member, of course, of the European Union, but has an opt-out in defense and foreign policy, traditionally because of neutrality. That is the tradition of the country, Denmark, but also of Sweden, for instance. There is a real reconsideration there, and Denmark will have a referendum even on getting rid of this opt-out and becoming a full member of the European Union, also in this domain of foreign and defense. So a lot is moving there in this
it's
region.
all the unintended consequences of decisions by Putin.
Yeah.
But I think the important part is as well that we've demonstrated exceptional political will on all fronts. We need to sustain this and think it through, and in a calm and reasoned manner also provide for the follow-through.
Yeah.
That's equally important.
Yeah, indeed, it was unimaginable 10 days ago that this would happen in a country like Denmark, for instance.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Yes, here I see.
Hi, thank you for coming. We've touched on energy dependency with regards to Russia. And for us as the Netherlands, Germany is a big partner. Forgive me if this is cliche, but is there anything we as the Netherlands can do to help Germany out of what is sort of a nuclear delusion? Can we help them, can we influence them to adopt more nuclear power?
If I wasn't, let me think about how I want to answer this. Maybe because I've always worked internationally, so I try to always consider issues from the perspective of the other as well, because it helps you sometimes get your message across better. I'm not quite sure that we need to persuade Germany. I mean, first of all, it's a sovereign nation and it has run through its own parcours. What we can do is make the right investments ourselves and really fast forward the energy transition, not only through climate adaptation, but also the right investments, industrial level, build the infrastructure required, and obviously make headway with the establishment of the 2 nuclear plants that were established in the political agreement that we've conducted with 2 parties, and demonstrate that diversity of energy sources is not an either or, that I think we have a fairly wide range. So I'm not quite sure if we need to persuade them. We need to demonstrate by doing the right things ourselves. So be an example is often the best element in persuasion.
Thank you. That also fits within the philosophy of institutional competition within the EU, that you can learn from each other. We have room for one last question. I see a candidate for a question here in the midst, in front. And that will be the last question of today.
Thank you, and thank you for your speech. A lot of questions goes about Russia and the war. but I want to point another part of your speech was about your position as finance minister and the euro, because you are going to talk with other finance ministers about the Stability Growth Pact and the reforms that maybe are coming. The euro is a great currency, and I think the most of us, or all of us, are proud of it. And but it has always a subject of discussion about the sustainability, the debts of some countries. And my question to you is, are the reforms and the discussion what's going about the Stability Growth Pact focused on to take that discussion away from the society, to make the euro give more trust in euro for all people, and that will help the discussion go away from our society about the sustainability of our euro?
Let me see if I got your question right. You believe the discussion should also reinforce confidence by ordinary citizens in the viability of the euro, and that it's not a sort of a debt trap indirectly?
Yes, about the confidence, and if the reforms are focused on the long run, about debt reduction, and just if that is enough, or if it's just for the medium, not the long term, but the medium term, and that the discussion maybe will go on, and further reforms of all the decisions are for the long run, which will not be taken in the discussion in the near future.
Well, I think, first of all, the public sentiments are often determined by the way we ourselves speak about them. And if we can demonstrate that the Stability and Growth Pact has actually helped us, and obviously I call them the rules of the game, that has provided not only the stability, but also it was an attempt at providing for economic convergence between the member states, that's the element that we need to talk about, as opposed to the levels of debt of others. It's super important, but you'll find now, if you look at the statistics, more and more countries are not necessarily in such a good place at the moment. So it's even more critical that we have this conversation to be ready for the future. When it comes to stability and growth and debt sustainability, we have really marked out the triangle. Yes, debt sustainability, but we need to help countries and find a pathway whereby debt reduction becomes real. At the moment, we've had many situations where we were collectively tough on the language and the expectations, but actually there were so many opt-outs within the complex system that was established that nobody actually had to adhere to it one way or another, and that creates distrust. And then public sentiment becomes increasingly critical and becomes very wary of the risks that a stronger economy or those who are firm on debt may actually be entangled with. And we want to avoid that. We want to build trust, but above all, we want to enable countries to reduce their debts, but be responsible for them. We want compliance, and we want effective oversight. And that's an important conversation. The Commission has indicated that given the fact that we may be, yes, coming out of the pandemic, but entering a new period of crisis, that the escape clause for the Stability Pact may be prolonged for another year. I'm not quite sure if we want to focus all our energy on combating that. We want to focus our energy on getting Stability Growth Pact, 202, that really deals seriously with debt reduction, but also promotes serious investments in climate change, in the digital economy, that in a way aligns with some of the RRF plans and the ambitions that we have for the energy transition as well, and that it enables that. So we end up with economic convergence, but also reforms, because economic growth hasn't happened in many countries, and neither the reforms. And those are they should be positive incentives as well. It's not a negative, it's a positive, but it's tough. And we have determined a number of practical steps forward as a Dutch government, which we want to bring to the table and the debate in all humility, because we keep, of course, the anchor of the 3% and the 60%. But no one else is talking about changing that either. Everybody's very clear that requires not only a change of the treaty, but it's not going to solve the heart of the matter. And so I think it may sound very far away, but the entire discussion on the Stability and Growth Pact, if we look in the bigger realm of Europe, prosperity, welfare and sustainability of our economic models, this instrument is quite central to keep it together and indeed also keep the euro safe.
I think that is very true. We will hear a lot about this issue in the coming months and years, and it's crucial for the cohesion of the European Union as a whole. Dear Minister, thank you very much for the time you took to come here to give a very important and rich speech, but also to open up after that speech for a general conversation with us. We are very grateful that you took the time to come here at this very critical moment in European history. And I think I speak on behalf of the complete audience with a warm thank you for this session here in Maastricht. Thank you very much.
For your time.
Now I ask the audience to leave through that door, and people who have other responsibilities here in the church for the follow-up program can stay, of course. So thank you very much again, and hope to see you in any future event.